Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hey there, thanks for joining me today. We are going to take a deeper dive into a topic that I've brought up before, a recommendation I've made earlier on in some of our previous episodes about podcasting your audiobook. Today, we're just going to focus on literally that one way of doing a podcast. There are lots of different options when it comes to podcasting, but we're going to focus in on the idea of you have your audiobook produced, now taking it, splitting it up, and podcasting it out to the world. First of all, let's take a look at why we would want to do that. It is true that if you are going to podcast out your entire audiobook, then you are essentially giving it away for free. Because most people don't pay for podcasts. That's not the model that is really working in the podcasting world. It's a little bit more like a radio show. So, first of all, I just want to address that concern about, am I going to lose revenue on my audiobook if, in fact, I provide the audiobook as a podcast? And I would say almost certainly no. You're not going to lose out on revenue. And in fact, you're more likely to sell more audiobooks when you use this technique. Here's why. You'll be reaching more listeners. And if people, depending on how you podcast it out, and we'll talk a little bit about the scheduling and the sort of that laying out of how you do your podcast, but you have the potential to actually have listeners start to listen to your audiobook. If you don't have all of your episodes live yet, then they may be eager to just go ahead and listen to the rest on their own schedule. Another reason why people would get the audiobook, even if you have it available on the podcast, even if all the episodes are available, many people like to listen to audiobooks in an audiobook listening app, and that can be really convenient. It's all very automated in terms of the playlist going forward, and that's not generally true in the podcasting world in the same way that it is in the audiobook world. In podcasting, you can choose to go and listen to the next episode, but they don't usually run as a playlist. These, however, are not the main reasons that you would want to podcast your book out. One of the big reasons is just coming back to reaching more listeners. I addressed the concern around that in terms of how it might impact your audiobook sales. But there's also just the fact that you're reaching more people who may not be listening to audiobooks yet. Or maybe they're only listening to them in the context of podcasts. What I can say is there are people out there who, as comfortable as they are in the podcasting world and downloading podcasts, listen to them all the time, they are not necessarily as familiar with or comfortable with the audiobook world. Whenever you get your content out into a particular region, and I say region in terms of a kind of a listening demographic, then you have the opportunity to have a greater impact. If you, for example, word of mouth is always a very big factor in how people find out about podcasts and audiobooks. If you have your book in podcast and someone's telling their friend, well, maybe their friend isn't a podcast listener, but they are an audiobook listener. There are a lot of different ways. And depending on your content, it may not just be about sales. It may be that your content is specifically having some kind of result or impact in the world that you really care about, and you want to make sure that the world benefits from the content that you're providing. And just to give you sort of a rough idea of about how many people are listening to podcasts or are expected to be listening to podcasts by the results of 2021, we're somewhere in the world of 118 million listeners in the podcast world. Let's shift into a little more of the nuts and bolts of the kinds of things that you're going to need. I want to say that this kind of podcast, this version that I am describing now, does not require you, as author, to provide any recording yourself. What I mean is, you do not need to stand in front of the mic. So if that's not comfortable for you, but you really want to have greater impact, reach a wider audience, this still works for you. So there is one recommendation I'll make a little later on where potentially you would be behind the mic, but it's not mandatory. Now, if being behind the mic is something that you enjoy, that is certainly something that you can put to work here, but I'm going to describe this kind of podcast without that component. So, one of the first things you're going to need is a trailer. And what that is, it is basically a description of your podcast. Well, since your podcast is your audiobook, what you really need is an audio of your book description. And you may also include something about the narrator, if there are music or sound effects or any famous musicians that are performing as a part of your audiobook. These are all things that you may want to add in. And you may also want to include the about the author as a part of your trailer. So, since your book description is not normally recorded as part of your audiobook process, it's really helpful if you're making this plan or you think you might make this plan before you're in audiobook production or while you're in production, that you ask your narrator to please also narrate your book description and any other components that I may describe here that you're going to need in order to do the podcast. If your audiobook is already produced and you don't have access to your narrator anymore, this can be done by somebody else. It doesn't have to be the narrator of your audiobook. You could do it. You could have somebody else do it. You could contact your narrator again or producer again and ask them if that's something that could be done either by your narrator or by some other voiceover professional. And before you take that step, just make sure that you have mapped out, written out in text, everything that you would want that narrator to voice for you. Let's just take a short break and come right back.
If you have a message to share with the world and you're considering a podcast, schedule a call with Becky at Pro Audio Voices. Whether you want to convert your audiobook into a podcast series or host a solo show or interview guests, whatever format best fits your message, your style, and your audience, Pro Audio Voices can help set you up for success and manage your podcast production all along the way. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com.
Okay, so once you have your trailer, that is going to act as episode 1 of your podcast. The next thing you're going to need to figure out is your intro. The intro is going to be the exact same intro for every episode. It is podcast intro, not an episode intro. Because this podcast is just your audiobook, you can use the opening credits of your audiobook for the podcast intro, and then you'll want to mix in music for the podcast if you don't already have music that's mixed into your opening credits. And possibly even if you do, you may want to change it up. So I'm just going to leave that as a possibility for you because you want the vibe of your music to fit the vibe of your audiobook. Alternatively, you could have a separate intro or a different intro recorded by your narrator or whoever is going to be that voice of your trailer. You can create a separate or different intro if you would like, and that may have a little more information about you as an author. It may speak to how frequently you're going to have your episodes go live. That sort of thing can be included in there. You may possibly, optionally, want to consider an episode intro for each episode. That could be sort of a quick synopsis, recap of the previous episode. So thinking along the lines of that your listener may have had some time pass between the time that they listened to the last one and when they're listening now, just to bring them back up to speed and into the story again. Again, this is totally optional, but it is something to consider because you want to make sure that if you do want to use that approach, that you have that material recorded. The next piece is your outro. The outro may be a consistent outro, or it may just be something as simple as in our next episode, and you just could put the title, especially if your episode has titles. So, for example, in our next episode, Chapter 3, The Skink Walks. And I have no idea why I just said skink. That just sort of fell out of my mouth, but whatever. So then maybe that's the title of your chapter and you would like to include that in that way as a part of your outro. Again, your outro, you want to have that with some music mixed in. So that is a piece that your audio editor should be handling. The good thing about doing this process sort of as a batch is that it won't take that long for an editor to prepare this material for you if it's all done as a batch, as one task, rather than spreading it out like one a week or something like that. That's not an efficient way to proceed. So, we've done intro, we've done episode intro as an option, and we've done outro. Those are all the audio components of what you need to do your podcast. But there is one other suggestion I want to make, and that is a kind of bonus episode at the end. If you don't have one already recorded, you might actually do this with your narrator as a possibility if your narrator's open for this. And that is that you could do a bonus episode where it's an interview. You and your narrator talking about the book, the process, whatever cool things happened or weird things happened or whatever. People love that kind of behind-the-scenes thing, and especially that's very popular in the podcasting world. Also, I want to say, if you have any bonus material, things that you can get away with not including in the podcast but are in the audiobook, you can let people know that that additional bonus material is available as a part of the audiobook. Remember, they haven't spent anything on the podcast. And if a listener really likes you and wants to support you, they're all the more likely to go purchase the audiobook, both so that they can have it in that format and also so they can support you. Moving on past the audio component section of what needs to happen for a podcast is the metadata section. And this kind of circles us back to the reasons why you want to do your audiobook as a podcast also. And that is, not only are you reaching more listeners, but you're also showing up in the virtual world, in the online, with more metadata. Each episode is going to have its own description. And as you write out your description of each episode, making sure that you're not putting any spoilers in there, but you can utilize that description to fill out, to use keywords. Keywords are so valuable, and being able to have that opportunity, a description for each of your episodes, is really great. Remember, with your audiobook, you get one description per platform. For example, Audible, you get one description of your audiobook. That's only one location where you get to have those keywords. And typically, the other retailers are going to be using the same description. So you're not getting quite potential reach as you might when you start engaging your podcast descriptions in terms of metadata. The other thing you're going to need is a cover image. You're going to need a square cover image, just exactly the same as your audiobook cover image. So you can use that same image. You just want to change, maybe add text that says podcast to that image, and that'll work just great. Then for your episode images, you can do the same thing. You can repeat that image, or you could have episode images. There is value in doing the episode images, and I'll describe a couple things you should think about as you're making those decisions. If you think about what it's like when you go to YouTube and you go to somebody's channel and all the images are the same, it's much harder to really select what you want to look at because we are so visually oriented that it's sort of extra work, right? To go read the text, even just the titles of those episodes. Whereas if you go to a channel where they're all on a similar topic and they have a kind of branded look, then it's more attractive. It's easier to select an episode that you're interested in. So with that in mind, it's important to have that branded look, but it's also valuable to have some variety. So think about what you might do to make that work. It could be that your audiobook cover is the background, and then on top of that, in some portion of that image, that you add some other picture that is appropriate for that particular episode. Differentiate them in some way, but keep them looking pretty similar. The other way you can take advantage of changed images is actually the way that you name your file for those episodes. If you put keywords right into those image file names before you upload them, that can be valuable as well. And then the last piece of this puzzle that we're going to cover today is about seasons. You could think of your podcast as your author podcast and your books each as a season. Now, there are a couple different kinds of podcasts. That one is that sort of ongoing episodic podcast where people can listen to episodes out of order and it doesn't matter. And then there is what they call a serial podcast, which really needs to be listened to in the proper order. So your audiobook is going to be a serial podcast. And I would recommend that one way you think about using your podcast is to put each of your books that is in audio as a season on your podcast. Now, that may mean, it probably will mean, that you have long gaps between seasons. That's okay, because in your podcast trailer, you're setting the expectation and clarifying how this podcast is going to work. They're not going to be looking for an episode every week. They're going to be expecting that each season is one complete audiobook. And earlier when I said that you want your music for your podcast intro to fit with the vibe of your book, I just want to come back to that for a moment because you might say that perhaps your second book in the podcast doesn't have the same vibe. It really needs different music for the podcast to be appropriate. It's okay to update your podcast intro to fit your most recent season. Totally fine to do that. And I'm going to call that a wrap for this week. Thank you again for being with me. If you have questions about podcasting and how to get your book out as a podcast and how all of that works, there are lots of details I was not able to cover in today's episode. Things like making sure that your podcast is syndicated so it gets out to all the major podcast channels, things like that. There are lots of things we could talk about with podcasts, and we'll come back to this topic in future episodes. Again, thanks for being with me. Reach out to us if you have questions. We're at proaudiovoices.com. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.